everyone. Hi, thanks for joining us for today's webinar. So today we're looking at tendering for public sector contracts, and we hope that afterwards you find that it's actually easier than you might have thought. I'm Miria. I deal with the client relationships for bid consultancy here at Practice and Tenders Direct, and with me I've got Andrew.
I don't know if everyone's catching me okay. I think we might have been. Hi guys, sorry about that slight technical hitch. That was entirely user error on my part. I'll say again, I'm Andrew Watson, the bid consultancy and training manager here at Practice Tenders Direct. And the two of us will be getting you through this webinar on Thursday lunchtime. I thought, and we're going to find out if it really is true, if tendering is in fact easier than you think. To start off with, guys, I wondered if we might do a little bit of a poll and get a read. There's actually like a very big crowd on the call, so really thanks for your attendance, but we could start with a little bit of a poll. See if the technology is going to be more favourable to me this time around, and yeah, we'll see if that one works. So what we thought we might do is launch this poll, and we'll just spend 30 seconds and see what's happening. So hopefully that's up on the screen for everyone. And we can start collecting. Now, obviously, if you are ticking the no box and it's completely straightforward to you, then thank you for your attendance anyway. Hopefully, you'll take something from it. But the vast majority of people have now voted, but do keep punching them in for another few seconds. So, do we find bidding in the public sector confusing or difficult? So we have 26%, so just over a quarter, saying yes, and we have nearly 70%, so on 69%, 67%. Some aspects of it are difficult or confusing, and then we only have a 4% smarty pants on the call who are saying no, it's relatively straightforward. I'm only joking. It's gone down to 3%, so people are ticking those boxes. So clearly, there's a lot of people who it just represents a little bit of a difficult space for, and the majority of people have some understanding, but definitely still find aspects of it a challenge. And hopefully across the course of the webinar, we'll be able to try and help a little bit more and provide some guidance as well. Thank you very much for taking part. It was really useful, and I see nearly everyone voted, and it's a really big crowd on the line, so thanks so much for that.
Okay, perfect. Let's get right into it. We do have quite a few slides to get through, but first I'll talk you through the topics we'll actually discuss today. So first of all, we want to make sure that you understand, excuse me, that we understand common tender structures and terminologies. With that, we'll also talk you through frameworks and dynamic purchasing systems and why they're a good place to start if you're new to the public sector. And we'll tell you what the usual process and timelines involved are in responding to tenders and how you can get bid ready. Part of getting bid ready is actually also building a relationship with buyers, which is something a lot of you have asked about in your registration, so we will talk about that as well. And we'll tell you how you can evaluate the answers versus the scoring criteria to help you write high scoring answers. And last but not least, we'll tell you how you can receive and use feedback that you get from buyers after you've submitted a bid. Okay, so first of all, we'll go over common tender structures and terminologies because it's really important that you understand what you're looking at when you go through tenders. Next slide, please. Oh, there we go. Sorry, that was a bit of a delay.
I think there's a lag.
So first of all, how are public sector tenders published? So usually anything that is above £10,000 for central government or £25,000 for local government needs to be published or should be published to the public and managed through a portal, a secure portal. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. We estimate around only 50% of contracts are actually published the way they should be, which can make it quite difficult to find the contracts you're looking for. You might have heard about low and high value tenders before, thresholds. So this threshold is set every 2 years, and it is for supply and services at £213,000, including VAT, And for works and constructions, this threshold is 5.3 million, including VAT again. So any contracts that are below this threshold are considered low value. It should be published on a portal called Contracts Finder. Anything that's above this threshold is considered high value and should be published on Find a Tender Service, or also called FTS. Now, basically, the buyer is meant to do this to make sure that the documents are free and available for everyone to find, making the process transparent and fair for everyone who wants to apply for it. Now, this leads us to the Public Contracts Regulations 2015, because they sort of tell the buyers that they need to be transparent and fair for everyone. So part of what the PCR tell us is that any tender that's published to Contracts Finder or Find a Tender needs to include the time limits for responses. So usually you have at least 30 days to respond to a tender. If it's really complex, you might have longer, or if it's a really pressing matter, it might also be slightly shorter. So it's something we saw a lot during COVID, where buyers actually only give you, for example, 10 days because they really needed to get PPE, for example. The contracts will also include how and to whom to respond to. That's really, really important that you understand how to respond, because in some cases, the buyer might ask you to fill out a document and then upload that to a portal, or they might ask you to directly fill your responses into a portal, or in a few cases, they might even ask you to email them their response, your response, which shouldn't technically happen, but it does still sometimes happen that they ask for that. They'll also tell you any other requirements that you might have to fulfill to participate. For example, any minimum requirements, any insurances, for example, or they could ask you that you have to accept the terms and conditions to participate, or in some cases they might ask you to come for a site visit before you can actually submit a bid. So it's really important to understand what you have to do and what's the requirements for you to participate. After a contract has been awarded, the buyer has 30 days to publish a contract award notice. Now that should contain the name and address of the winning supplier, the contract start date and value, as well as how many other suppliers have applied for this contract and whether an SME or a VCSE has won. Now this is really important because you can actually learn a lot from the contract award notices, and in the future it'll help you when you bid again. We'll go over that in more detail later on, but essentially it's quite important that you do monitor these contract award notices as well. Slide please. Perfect. So there are quite a few different procurement procedures that can be used depending on the buyer requirements and depending on what they need and how complex it is. But there are two that are most common, which is the open procedure and the restricted procedure. So in the open procedure, anyone can apply to bid for the tender, bid for the contract. You essentially have a selection stage, which is usually a questionnaire where you provide the buyer with your basic information, as in your company name, address, status, any sort of insurances or certifications that you have, and other basic information like your annual turnover, or if any of your directors have any fraudulent charges, for example. The buyer uses that to make sure that you are a suitable fit for them. And then we have what we call the award stage, which is where you provide more sort of quality answers of how you're going to deliver a contract and how you're going to make sure that you deliver it well. In the open procedure, these are both responded to in the same stage. So you fill both out at once, you submit it to the buyer. The buyer then has to consider all responses equally and has to evaluate all of them, and then basically award the contract to the most suitable bid. In the restricted procedure, we actually have the selection stage first. So you fill out your questionnaire first and provide it to the buyer, and the buyer then only invites suitable suppliers to the next stage and invites them to provide their quality answers. So this is often also called a two-step process because you have the two steps. Next stage, please. Okay, and we'll go over some common tender terminology as well. And there are quite a lot of very specific terms, and again, it's really important that you understand what you're looking at when you go through the tenders. So I've already mentioned the high and low value thresholds, but just to mention them again, for supplies and services, the threshold is £213,000, including that. Anything below or above that falls, as said, below under the threshold. And for works contract, the threshold is 5.3 million. So again, this determines whether something is a low or high value contract. You'll probably come across CPV codes quite regularly as well. So CPV stands for Common Procurement Vocabulary. Essentially, the buyer uses these codes to categorize their contract. So for example, the buyer could be looking for building maintenance, so they might use the CPV code maintenance. It is worth noting that you have to be quite cautious with these because they can be slightly inaccurate. As I said, the buyer might be looking for building maintenance and use the CPV code maintenance, and you provide, for example, boiler maintenance, but you still get that building contract through because you've looked for the code maintenance. When we look at actually awarding contracts, you might have come across MEAT or MAT, which stands for Most Economically Advantageous Tender, or just Most Advantageous Tender. And that essentially means that the buyer is looking to award the contract to the buyer, to the supplier who can provide the best value for money, not to the cheapest bidder. You might have also come across RFQ, RFP, and ITT, which stands for Request for Quote or Proposal, which is often when the buyer directly sends a requirement to specific suppliers and asks them to provide just a quote. The invitation to tender really is more common within the contracts that are published publicly. And often within a contract notice, you'll find a document called invitation to tender, which usually outlines the sort of requirements that the buyer has. And lastly, we've got the PQQ, SPD, and SQ. These are all forms of pre-qualification questionnaires. As I mentioned earlier, when we have the selection stage, this is usually where the buyer will use these questionnaires to find out any basic information from you that they need to make sure that you are a suitable fit for them. Earlier I mentioned frameworks and dynamic purchasing systems. So as I said, these are a really good place to start, especially if you're a bit newer to the public sector bidding or if your company hasn't been around for that long. So essentially, when you think about a framework or dynamic purchasing system, you can think about them almost like a pre-approved supplier list. So the buyer has already done their research, you've already provided them with your questionnaire and your quality answers, and they have essentially added you to a list of preferred suppliers. So now when they want to buy something, they don't have to go out and publish a whole tender again. They can go to the approved list of suppliers that are on the framework or on the DPS and ask them to supply what they need. Both frameworks and DPSs need to be published on the portals that I mentioned earlier when they're first established. But beyond that, there's actually quite a few differences between the two of them. So a framework actually cannot be any longer than 4 years. After 4 years, it has to end and it needs to be retendered. Only buyers that have been named when it was first established can actually use the framework, and they need to be quite specific. So for example, when someone sets up a framework, they can't say local councils are allowed to use this. They would have to say specifically which local council can use this as a buyer. Suppliers can only join when the framework is first advertised. So if you don't get onto the framework, that's it, you missed your chance. You have to wait until it's re-established in 4 years. Also, the buyer can limit the number of suppliers that they want to admit to the framework. So they can say only the 5 most compelling bids actually get onto the framework. There's quite a few different multiple call-offs mechanisms within a framework. For example, the buyer can directly award a contract to a supplier on the framework, or they can send a mini competition to selected several suppliers on the framework, or they can just send out a tender to everyone who is already on the framework. Now, when we look at the dynamic purchasing system, or DPS, there's actually no maximum time limit for this to run, so the buyer could run this for as long as they want to. Any supplier that meets the minimum selection criteria must be accepted onto the DPS, and the buyer cannot limit the number of suppliers that are on here. The good thing here as well is that if you do not make it onto the DPS, the buyer has to give you feedback and tell you why you didn't make it, what you need to change, and then you can reapply. In general, suppliers can apply at any point to join the DPS, but the buyer might have certain intake times. So for example, the buyer might specify that they're only going to review applications every 3 months and admit new suppliers every 3 months. So it's definitely worth checking when the actual intake times are, but you can apply at any point. Also, the buyer that runs the DPS can't just award a contract to a specific supplier within the DPS. Everyone who's been admitted to the DPS has to be given the chance to tender for a contract.
Okay, I'm hoping. Okay, I'm hoping I managed to do some spectacularly technical with my speaking, but with my muting, but hopefully that's been resolved, and I'll go through the next section with you guys. I just wanted to say we do have the sort of chat function for questions, and you are welcome to punch in questions all throughout the webinar, and hopefully, assuming I don't ramble on too much, we will have time to answer questions at the end. One of the questions that's been asked a couple of times already is about access to the slides to review. We are covering quite a lot of ground. We want to give lots of value, but it does mean a little bit of a review later on can be helpful, but you will get a link to be able to rewatch the webinar and revisit the slides at your leisure as well. So if there's something that maybe needs a little bit more time to digest, then you will get that opportunity. You get sent a link afterwards to do so. But do punch in any specific questions you have, and we will try and address them towards the end of the webinar as well. So one of the areas we said we would cover was around basically responding to tenders, and that's a massive area, and it's basically what our D&I's job is about, finding and supporting our clients in terms of the opportunities they have to be as successful as possible. So there is a lot to it. It could be a bit of a mega topic, but we'll try and go over some of the fundamentals, so you can sense check that you're doing the right things, or that you can start doing them right from the off when you're kind of going on this journey. First stage is about finding the opportunities. Medea had touched upon the two different government portals that are supposed to basically cover all the opportunities: Find a Tender Service and Contracts Finder. The reality is, specifically around lower value notices, there is an issue with the authorities' adherence to that regulation in terms of actually making sure that the opportunities get pushed onto those websites. So they are a good starting place to look, and it's obviously a free and openly accessible resource. As you kind of get a little bit more further down the line, you're probably, and you're doing it more frequently, you're going to want probably a system that able to capture the full public sector and have a more sophisticated ways of categorizing those opportunities for yourselves. That's into the realm of a subscription service and Tenders Direct. A lot of you guys are already members. Those that aren't, would highly recommend that you have a look at it, and when you're taking this seriously, you can have a look at those opportunities and see how much of the market we're capturing that your other sources aren't. And we do have a completely free full functionality 2-week trial that's available to all non-members as well, so you can kind of utilize that full functionality and get that feel for what exactly is the size of the available market for me, and that's a totally free, no obligation trial. So I would recommend that you go on our website and do that if you're not already members. In terms of the piece around registering interest and timelines, now, just again, the very fundamentals, the contract notice that you're going to see on those government websites or on Tenders Direct, the notice that tells you the kind of summary details about a given opportunity, should always contain links that are going to take you onto the portal where the procurement is being run from. So that's actually the buyer's portal, and there are a large number of different companies that supply portals that buyers can then use. If you're new to that given portal, you've never been on it before, you will have to register your company details on it. It doesn't take too long, it's just a few minutes, and then you get sent a validation link and you can register. Once you've done that, you can sign into the given portal, register, or sometimes it's called expressing your interests. That will allow you to view the full documentation around the opportunity. And that's what you're going to need to make a definitive decision about whether it's an opportunity that you want to pursue or not. In terms of the timescale you've got to do that, well, most contracts, not all, but most contracts are open for a minimum of 30 days from the contract notice being issued through to the deadline before which you have to respond. Like I say, it's usually 30 days. Some authorities will give longer, especially for larger complex projects. There are occasions where it can be a compressed timeline as well, so you do need to be looking out for that. And that's why it's important to start looking at looking at and evaluating opportunities as soon as those contract notices are launched, to give yourselves the best possible opportunity to do so. So you want to really start evaluating and understanding whether this is an opportunity that's going to be viable for you to pursue as quickly as possible, starting that bid no bid process as soon as you can, so that you don't end up with a small amount of time to actually construct a response if you do decide to go for it. And I've worked with lots of clients who, as a standard process, they tend to spend far too much of that window evaluating whether or not they're going to pursue it, and then actually the bid response itself is much more rushed as a result, which is the kind of other way around that it should be. So do be aware of that. In terms of beyond sort of finding opportunities, we're talking about getting ready to bid, making sure we're in a good position to do that. And I'll pass on to Medea to talk about that a bit more.
Thanks, Andrew. So as Andrew just mentioned, obviously you should do the bid no bid decision as soon as possible, really as soon as the contract you're interested in comes through. The thing about the bid no bid decision also is that it's not a one-time event and then you're done for the rest of your bidding process. It's really something that should happen throughout as you learn new information. For example, the clarification question gets answered and you learn new information, you should reevaluate if this is still a good fit for you. It's really important that when you decide on whether you want to bid for a contract, that you factor in the cost of actual bidding. So how many of your staff members are going to have to work on this bid? How long is it going to take them? And how much of their time will be spent on this? Then again, meaning how much is that going to cost your company? And how much time will that take away from other projects that they can't work on during that time? You also have to consider if it's a big contract or a really important contract for yourself, if you're going to engage a bid consultant, and then how much is that going to factor into your overall bidding cost. It can be quite costly for you as well if you don't do this decision process properly. So if you skim over the bid no bid decision and you decide to bid and you spend 20 days on writing your bid and then realize actually you don't qualify, you don't have the minimum requirements, so actually it's not really a good fit for your company, and then you will have wasted a lot of time and resources on putting this bid together. So it's really important that you do this step very thoroughly. It's quite a good idea to have a set process in place and have a specific person or a specific team responsible for making this decision. That'll also help you make this decision more timely rather than letting it drag on for quite a while. And sometimes while you are in the process of making this decision or while you're in the process of gathering all the information you need, it might feel like you don't actually have all the information you need. That doesn't necessarily mean you shouldn't bid, but it does mean that it might help you find out what research you need for the future. For example, if you are wondering if you should bid for a contract or not, and you actually realize you don't really know which of your competitors might be bidding for it as well, then that could reveal a good area for you to research in the future. So here are some key questions that you should ask yourself when you decide to bid for a contract or not. Now, it's really important to note that these are only some very basic questions. This is definitely not an exhaustive list, and you should really ask yourself what kind of factors are important to you as a company and to you in your industry that should make or break bidding for a contract. But these are some basic questions that you should also ask yourself. So first of all, do we want to win this contract? That means, is the contract with a buyer that has a good reputation? Is it with a buyer that you want to align yourself with? Does it take your company where you want to go? As in, does it fit in with your business strategy and your product development? Or does it really take away too many resources from other projects that are more important to you at the moment? You should also ask yourself if you actually meet the requirements to bid. So do you have all the minimum requirements, such as the minimum annual turnover, insurances, certifications, accreditations, all of these. We'll go over these in a little bit more detail in just a moment, but it's important that you're aware exactly what the minimum requirements are before you start to bid. You also want to ask yourself if you can actually deliver the contract. So that means, do you have the capacity to actually deliver the contract in the time frame and to the quality that you have promised the buyer? If you end up being awarded a contract, but you actually can't deliver it fully, that might have quite some reputational damage for you, and it might really affect your future business. And lastly, you want to ask yourself, can you realistically win? So again, this goes back to really understanding who else might be bidding for a contract as well. Do you have a realistic chance against your competitors? Or maybe for this specific requirement, your competitor's solution might actually be a better fit than yours. Or, you know, it might be the other way around. Maybe you actually do have the better fit, and that's great, and you can go for the bid. But it's really important to ask yourself that and be quite pragmatic about it. Perfect. So as I mentioned, there are some minimum requirements that you need to make sure you're aware of. So what do you need to actually qualify for a bid? So this really varies from industry to industry and tender to tender. There's no one size fits all type of answer to this. So you need to reevaluate this every single time you get a contract through that you're interested in, because even within the same industry and even within the same buyer, the minimum requirements might vary. Quite often though, these are things that are asked for. So as a rule of thumb, often you're asked for 2 times the annual turnover of the overall contract value, which is why it might be worth looking more at lower value contracts if you're a newer company with a lower turnover, because you're much more likely to qualify for those tenders. Now, again, this isn't a rule that applies all the time, but this is sort of a rule of thumb type of rule. Usually, you'll also be asked for at least 2 references. They should be related to the contract that you're applying for. So even if you haven't been working in the public sector before, these can be private sector experiences or references, as long as they're relevant to the contract you're applying for. It's really important that you make sure you have these in place before you actually start bidding, because otherwise that's really gonna put some time stress on your bidding process if you start to trying to sort out things like that while actually putting together your bid. Usually you'll be asked for at least 3 years of financial accounts. If your company is less than 3 years old, you'll be able to provide alternative things like a profit and loss statement or a balance sheet. Usually they have to be accredited by an accountant, certified by an accountant, and often you also have to provide a letter from your bank stating your current account balance. Oftentimes you'll also have to have a certain limit of insurances. So it's really important that you double check what the level is for each contract. You don't have to actually have the required insurance in place as you apply, but essentially you're committing to putting it in place if you should be winning the tender. So it's really important that you understand in advance what the cost implication for you are if you do win and if you do have to put the insurance in place. Usually you'll be asked for certain certifications and qualifications. Common ones are, for example, ISO certifications or Cyber Essentials. Again, it's important that you have these in place before you start bidding, because especially ISO is quite a long process of getting it in place, and it's not something you want to start trying to put in place as you apply for a really important tender. There's also industry-specific accreditations. Again, these will be different from industry to industry, but you'll usually know roughly what's asked for in your industry. If you're not really sure though, it's really worth going and looking at tenders that are out currently and seeing what buyers usually ask for, so you get a good idea of what's usually requested and what you should consider putting in place for yourself. And a lot of the times buyers will also ask for internal processes and policies such as quality management or health and safety procedures. So again, it's important that you have these in place and ready to go when you do start applying for bids. Another big part of getting bid ready is actually doing your research. So you need to understand your buyer as well as your competitors. So I did briefly mention in terms of the buyer, you should understand where the requirement has come from. So whether this is a new contract or whether they are retendering. If they're retendering, it's worth understanding who's the incumbent, as in who's currently holding the contract. Why are they retendering? Has the contract expired, or are they unhappy with the performance? And what is it they're actually looking for? Has the requirement changed? Are they looking for anything specifically? So this is a really good time to really understand what the buyer is looking for. In terms of your competitor, you want to understand who else is going to go for the bid, who else is likely to bid for this contract, what is their sort of positioning within the market? Do they position themselves as the cost leader, or do they position themselves as the value leader, or do they have a very unique selling point, or do they have anything that adds specific value? So it's really important to understand what your chances are compared to your other applicants for each bid. And lastly, we'll talk about building relationships with buyers. So usually, or not usually, actually all the time, when a buyer publishes a contract, they aren't allowed to speak to you directly after it's been published. This is again to make sure that the process stays fair and transparent to all suppliers that want to bid for the contract. Now this goes hand in hand with researching your buyer really. So what you should be doing is monitoring PINs, which is a prior information notice, and contract award notices. So the prior information notice is usually published by the buyer before they go out to tender. This is usually sort of a market engagement exercise where they really do want the suppliers to get in touch with them and tell them what's out in the market and what can they supply. So this is the perfect chance for you to get in touch with the buyer and find out all the points I mentioned previously, as in, is there currently an incumbent holding this contract? Where has it come from? What is it the buyer looking for? What is the direction that they want to go with this? And in terms of contract award notices, as I mentioned earlier in the webinar, the contract award notice usually contains information such as the winner of the contract value, the contract duration. So if you look at a contract award notice, from example, three years ago, and the contract duration was 3 years, then you can see that's probably due to retender soon. So monitoring these old contract award notices is a really good way to sort of ensure that you know what's going to come out in the future. Andrew previously mentioned our Tenders Direct tool. We do actually have an advanced tender alert tool which scans the contract award notices for you and then alerts you when a new contract is due to come out soon. But essentially within these contract awards, you also find the detail of the person who has previously dealt with the contract. So you can get directly in touch with them and speak to them about the contract that's hopefully a way to come out and what their requirements are, what they're looking for. If the person isn't looking after this tender anymore, you can easily ask who is now responsible for this. So in general, when you also ask yourself whether you should bid for a contract or not, it's important to ask yourself whether you actually have an existing relationship with the buyer, or if you're going in cold. Because if you have that existing relationship with the buyer, they're not allowed to favor you because they know you, but you might have a better idea of their requirements and what they're looking for. So you're definitely at an advantage.
Okay, guys, I'm going to give a little bit of a whistle-stop tour through answers and scoring criteria, try and give you some pointers and tips when you're actually, you know, in the trenches and filling these in. So we'll go through a few different tips and approaches, things to think about and bear in mind as you're kind of completing and navigating the world of actually constructing responses. So very important tip, the evaluation scoring. Don't make assumptions about how this is going to work or how it's going to be. The evaluation scoring is going to be different in every single tender, so you do need to be aware of what is the mechanism that's being used to evaluate my response in this specific instance, because it will vary and can be vary quite dramatically from tender to tender. So don't make assumptions, read through all of the documentation issued in the ITT and make sure that you fully understand everything around the submission you're going to put together, including how it's going to be evaluated. I won't go on about it much, but they mentioned how scoring is done normally is the meet most economically advantageous tender, but do check what that means within the specific context of the tender you're applying to. You're always going to find a quality component and you're going to find a commercial component. The quality component may also contain social value, or it may be a standalone piece, but you need to understand what the components are and how they are interlinked to give you the overall scoring. What are the mechanisms within those that are being used to award scores as well, because they will vary from tender to tender as well, which we'll just come on to right now. Just a couple of examples that have been taken from recent tenders. So you can see in the sort of top over to the left-hand side, there's a small table there which has got an example where pricing was 70% of the overall score and customer requirements, i.e. quality, was 30%. In the other example, you can see it's weighted more towards quality, with 60% of the marks being around quality in one form or another, and 40% being around cost and commercial viability, which is just a way of saying effectively price. You can see the table on the more detailed table's got a lot of the points that are sort of pass-fail as well, but again, it should give you an idea. These type of breakdowns should give you an idea of how is it going to be evaluated. What does that mean for what they're looking for, and what does it mean to how I go about constructing my response and spending my time up to the deadline. Just a quick pointer. I kind of managed to labour the different ways in terms of the best way to explain this, but this is the most common method you'll see for scoring, for commercial scoring. Let me importantly caveat that this is not the only formula that's used. You will see tenders where this is a different mechanism that's used to evaluate your score versus opponent's score. Commercials are almost always done on the basis of the lowest scoring one gets awarded full marks, and then the higher priced ones will get awarded a proportion of those marks. In this specific example, you can see supplier 2 is, you can see the formula there, which is the lowest bid divided by supplier's bid times the price weighting. So in this example, its pricing was 60%. Supplier 2 is, or supplier 1 is 29% cheaper than supplier 2. So supplier 2 is going to lose 29% of the available marks, i.e. they're going to score 43% out of an available 60%. So it's important to understand the mechanism, because it's some of the mechanisms that are used in some submissions are much more geared than that. So if you were, 29%, or they were 29% cheaper, you would get more heavily penalised than that. So do look out, make sure you see what's there, and to have an understanding of how that should influence your commercial strategy for the submission. In terms of the quality aspect of the submission, just to highlight the point that you're always going to see, there are an infinite number, because it's not prescribed what these look like, of potential scoring criteria in terms of, is it a 1 to 10 point scale, is it a 0 to 10 point scale, is it a 0 to 3 point scale? It could be any of these, and the wording that that describes the different levels isn't prescribed. So again, that's going to vary a lot from submission to submission. So in this case, you can see to score at the highest level on the larger table provides excellent and strong evidence to demonstrate a full robust response, whereas on the other table, to score in the highest category, it's high confidence of the tenderer's ability to satisfy the requirements. So when I'm constructing my answers, I need to be aware of what the wording of those is, and also what the wording on the category down is, to understand what do I need to load my answer with to make it aligned clearly to that top scoring answer, because we always need to be aiming at that. So for example, a lot of the time you'll see ones which will talk about adding value, or will talk about innovation. If the highest scoring criteria is a reference to innovation, you need to be putting references to innovation in your answer to give yourself a chance of attaining that highest score. So be sensitive to how it's been laid out and what the description of the scoring categories are. This is a really sounds fundamental, but even quite experienced people responding to bids, when I've evaluated their work, this is a really big area where people are not sensitive enough to that scoring criteria and are leaving marks on the table unnecessarily as a result. So don't be that guy. Okay, just to have a very quick spin through feedback, because it is important to both make sure you understand that you should be getting it and also what to do with it. Buyers are obligated to give feedback, so it should be clear from the contract award notices. It's a common record, it's public record who's won the contract, but beyond that, if you've participated in the procurement, you should be given your scores, see those against the winning scores. From that, for the commercial aspect, you can actually calculate what the winning prices were by working back whatever formula was issued, and there should be some at least summary feedback around, well, why were the gaps in terms of my quality scores versus the successful ones? What were the gaps? And you should be using that to basically understand why you weren't successful if you weren't, and for you to have the opportunity to then build upon that and improve into the future. So do I understand really what the issue was? Was it to do with the quality of the solution I was proposing? Was it to do with the way I'd structured my answer? Did I not provide enough evidence? Was it not focused enough on some of the specifics around the question? I need to understand what the reasons for the gaps were, and then I need to be clever enough and forward thinking enough to have a process to build that into my future responses, so I'm not making the same mistake. I'm learning from those. So that was very whistle stop. I do apologise if it was a little bit, but again, you guys are very welcome to go back and look through the webinar at your own leisure. Now, we have a little bit of time left. I'll hand it, Medea, do you want to, I'll bring up the registration questions. Do you want to maybe go through one of these ones? And in the meantime, I will look at some of the live questions, and then maybe I'll answer one of those.
Sure, sounds good. So one of the questions that we got quite a lot actually was, do new and smaller companies actually have any chance of winning contracts? And the short answer is yes, absolutely. But the longer answer is that the government has actually put in a commitment to spend every £1 in £3 on SMEs and smaller businesses. Quite recently, there's actually been a guide that's been published to buyers as well to help them really drive that commitment. So the public sector is aware that it's more difficult for smaller companies, but they are trying to get contracts out to you as well. As I did mention earlier, it might be worth looking at lower value contracts because you're just more likely to qualify for those. And it's really worth it starting with dynamic purchasing systems because they're easier to get on than win a full contract as a single supplier. And as I mentioned, if you do something wrong, they tell you what went wrong and how you can get on the DPS the next time you apply. So I know it can feel tough going up against bigger companies, but yes, you definitely do have a chance as a small company as well.
Thank you. Were asked, so we can answer those quickly as well. So this may be a silly question, the person said. There's no such thing as a silly question, only the question you don't ask. Where can you find out what the tender is about? It can be confusing to know if a tender is suitable for your organization. So this isn't a silly question at all. We've highlighted the either accessible, the government websites that have the contract notices plus our own service that categorizes them all. Either way, you're going to see a contract notice which is going to give you that summary information about what the opportunity is actually about. The reality is that that's never going to be enough information for you to say yes, 100% we should go for this. And sometimes, I take your point, actually it can be quite unclear as to really what is the scope of the services that are being requested through it. We mentioned it a little bit earlier in the webinar, but the reality is to get that confirmation, you're going to have to go through, register on the portal that's hosting the procurement. You're going to have to look at the documents, download that document pack, and then go through. There will be documents that will show you the minimum requirements that are requested of you, as Medea spoke about earlier on. It's also going to be documents or a section in the documents which has got the specifications, which is going to let you know kind of really what it is they're looking for and hopefully at what kind of scale as well. So little bit of a process to go through, and you will get faster at doing that once you've had a bit more experience as well in terms of doing that. I'll answer one more really fast, if that's okay. Medea mentioned on a DPS, they're bound to let you know why you didn't qualify. Does the same apply for frameworks? Yes, it does. So a framework, in the same as any formal tender submission you will get that feedback on it. So frameworks have typically they will have a limited number of suppliers that they're looking to accept onto it, although not always. If it's a limited number, then it becomes a competitive process. So if the answers and the proposals that were put forth by other suppliers were deemed of a higher quality, then they would be accepted onto the framework instead of you. But in that case, the same feedback mechanism that I spoke about very briefly a few minutes ago will apply. So you will still get the scoring. You get to understand what was your scoring versus what was the successful party scoring, and they should provide that summary feedback about what the gaps between those were. And I should say as well that if you are looking to go into more detail, you can specifically ask them for a debrief to go into, and hopefully they would agree to that, to go into a little bit more detail about a bit more detail about some of your answers and why those gaps existed and what the kind of root cause of that gap was, so you can then adjust and improve for the future. Just thinking, I'm just looking at the time. We did say it would be 1:45. Guys, I put a link in the chat to basically a shared calendar for our team. Everyone's very welcome. Anyone that wants to, you can use that link to book a meeting in with us. If you have any issues, concerns, anything you want to explore in a little bit more detail, we can do free 30-minute appointments with you guys. It's absolutely free. It's open to TD members and also to non-Tenders Direct members. We can go into any issues that you might be specifically facing in your organizations and kind of delve into them and provide some guidance and support in a little bit more detail than we're able to on the webinar. So please do feel free to kind of go into that link and do book in with ourselves. We did run out of time to go through all the questions. Again, there's loads of free resources on our website. You've got lots of webinars that you can go on to. There's the training courses that we run. They're run remotely at the moment, but they are it's with a live instructor. We have fabulous feedback on them on our surveys and on Trustpilot. We've got some resources there, and anyone that's not a TD member, I highly recommend going on to our website, signing up for that free full functionality access 14-day trial and really understand the full scope of your market by doing so. Lastly, just to bring up the final details that are there, that's the telephone number to contact us. Feel free to give us a ring at any point. That's our shared inbox. So again, drop us an email. We will send out follow-up emails just to get some feedback from you guys about the webinar. And if there are any specific questions, we'd be very happy to answer them, and obviously to go into those, do those kind of more detailed sessions with yourselves as well. I think that's all from my side. Medea?
Yeah, that's really it. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. I hope you were able to take away lots from this, and I hope a lot of you have gone from finding it very confusing to finding it at least a little bit less confusing. Obviously, feel free to begin a meeting with either of us, and we'll be more than happy to help if there's any questions that haven't been answered yet. Again, thanks for joining, and hopefully speak to you soon.